I'm going to welcome Carol Witham to the podium. I'm sure you all know Carol. She's a self-taught botanist, a vernal pool ecologist and expert, and a teacher among many other hats that she wears. And Carol has also been very instrumental in putting on this conference. She has performed duties as the conference executive committee chair, conference organizing committee chair, program committee chair, abstract review chair, member of steering committee, and also a California Poppy sponsor. Welcome, Carol.
So an important note to self is do not allow people to buy you drinks until the bar closes the night before you're supposed to give a talk. Anyway, I'm going to, this talk is about merging two different projects and reanalyzing the results based on the new information. And Bob Holland always jokes that you have to redo your PhD thesis about once a decade. This is going to be the project that's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. So I'm going to talk about the status of Orcuttieae and Chamaesyce hooveri in the Great Valley. Essentially, these are the federally listed species that are endemic to vernal pools. There's one grass in the Neostoppia genus, 4 in the Orcuttieae, and 2 in Tinctoria. And then because it co-occurs with these rare grasses so often, I also did some work on Chamaesyce hooveri, or Hoover spurge. So up until recently, our basic knowledge of what was going on with these species was based upon field surveys that were conducted in 1986 and 1987 by Biosystems Analysis. They spent 2 summers running around using USGS topo maps and surveying for these species and then reporting on them. I resurveyed these sites in 2010 and 2011, and the person who does this again sometime 25 years from now will have at least really good GIS data because they did use modern technology to record these species occurrences. I managed to visit well over half the sites. It says that the ones that weren't visited was because they were either behind no trespassing signs or in orchards or vineyards or whatever. And in all honesty, is there anyone in here from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? I went behind no trespassing signs on a fairly regular basis if I thought I could get away with it. So the 2010 and 11 surveys were conducted in that dead of the summer throughout the Central Valley. I put 10,000 miles on my car. It was pretty amazing. I updated the information on all 288 occurrences, and that included documenting 15 new occurrences and reporting 11 erroneous occurrences. And it's sort of odd to report an occurrence as being a mistake. If it's your own mistake, you can say, oh, well, I don't know what I was thinking when I put the dot on the map there. It was really over here. But it's more difficult to report other people's mistakes and often involves having to research their collections over a several-day period of time to figure out where they really were at when they reported the species from some other location. So that was sort of an interesting endeavor in itself. Out of those 288 element occurrences, 60 of them are known to be extirpated. 19 are probably extirpated, and if they're not, they will be very soon. And then this whole thing was just massive data analysis, and everything was presented by element occurrence, species, core recovery areas. So it ended up with lots and lots of tables and graphs and GIS stuff. But I think I want to talk a little bit more about some of my take-home messages from this survey. And that is, annual species do not intuitively go into groups of increasing, stable, declining. They're annual species. In a good year, you've got a bazillion of them, and in a poor year, you may have none, or you may only have one or two. And so I looked more at persistently occupied locations, places where you find the plant year after year in varying number sizes, versus places where there was suitable habitat, but there are not plants every single year. And that basically forms sort of metapopulations for all of these species. At the bottom, Sacramento orchid grass in a really good year in a persistent population, and on the right, Solano grass in a persistent population that has never had more than 200 plants. The other thing I found, which was sort of a conundrum, was that there were persistent populations in some pretty weird locations. Everybody see the hairy orchid grass growing in rows in that left-hand picture? That's a plowed site, and the orchid grass grows in rows every year. On the right-hand side is slender orchid grass, persisting despite feral pigs tilling up their habitat on a regular basis. But then I also had some really sad findings. For those of you who don't recognize what that is, that's called deep ripping. They take these monstrous tractors with these monstrous metal rods, and they go through and they break up the hardpan. So there was a lot of illegal deep ripping activity I reported during the course of this field survey. And remember, I was only looking for where these rare grasses were, so there may have been a lot of other illegal stuff going on that I didn't notice because it wasn't in my target area. So fast forwarding to, I published this report in 2013, and fast forwarding to last year, just before the call for abstracts was out, some new things came along that I thought were important. One of them was the US EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service are actually enforcing some of the illegal activities that I reported. But the other thing that became really important is Bob Holland and I, and I'm sure many of you saw his talk this morning, worked on this remote mapping project together. And we did a base map as of the 2005 Vernal Pool Ecosystem Recovery Plan. And then we remapped everything according to the 2012 imagery. So we have a 7-year snapshot of what's happening in the vernal pool landscapes. It was an interesting mapping project. Bob would go to his office map, I would go to my office map. We'd put two maps on top of each other, and then we'd argue about which boundary was the right boundary. And because of that, I think it's one of the best maps that's been done in a long time. So it was a 21.4 million acre study area, and we mapped 800,000 acres of vernal pool habitat. And these aren't individual vernal pools, these are grasslands in which there was a definite vernal pool signature. We mapped according to the density or the cover of vernal pools. So in this map, the darker the green, the more vernal pools there were. And then we remapped in 2012. And what that came up with is, in a 7-year period of time, we lost over 6,000 acres a year of vernal pool habitat. We lost a total of 47,000 acres. We added some stuff too, though. There were new mitigation banks that were created in places like Placer County, where people were destroying vernal pools and then making new vernal pools in another location. There was a real disturbing factor, this one here, in which people would take low density vernal pool habitat and go in with heavy equipment, and just jam-pack that location with artificial vernal pools. And then we also added some acreage that we missed in 2005 because we missed it in 2005. So what I did for this talk is I intersected those two projects. I knew how many Orcuttieae populations were extirpated and everything else, but what I didn't know was the time frame. And so of the 60 extirpated populations of the Orcuttieae tribe grasses, 10 of them have been extirpated since the publication of the recovery plan. So we're not doing very good. If we can lose that many populations when there's a recovery plan out there, we're supposed to be doing good things for these species, and yet we haven't figured out how to regulate agricultural conversion. So another aspect of the map that Bob and I just finished was all of a sudden, at the very end of us getting all of our data together and everything else, a whole bunch of databases on protected areas became available. And so there's 4 different sources of protected area information. I can promise you they all didn't agree. They didn't agree on parcel boundaries, anything else. We just sort of merged all of them to give some idea of how much was protected out there. And there's a whole bunch of limitations about data. More recent acquisitions wouldn't be reflected. None of the Department of Fish and Wildlife conservation easements are in the database. None of the military areas are in the database. And then, some of them were just plain wrong, So, and then the final caveat that I think is really important is that protected, meaning if there's a conservation easement or it's owned in fee title or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that it's being managed for resources. And a good example of that is, there's 40,000 acres or more in Merced County that is vernal pool habitat that has some of these endangered species on it that are being managed for waterfowl habitat. And so the flooding regime is not natural, a number of other items like that. But this is the map that shows the dark blue. You can see this is like the San Luis wildlife area. This is like the Kern wildlife area. A lot of the protected areas, 12%, is waterfowl habitat. But the amazing number to me was this one up here. When Bob and I were first talking about running this analysis, we both guessed that the number would be less than 10%. And so to know that 30% of the vernal pools out there are probably under some form of protection was eye-opening, actually. We are moving forward. A lot of it is the Nature Conservancy acquiring large acreages up here and down, and the UC Merced forcing it down there. And so we are protecting this stuff. So for my group of plants, the plants that I'm really interested in, I merged the 2 data sets again in order to figure out how much of the extant occurrences, how many of the extant occurrences were being protected in some way or another. And we've done really well on some of these. More than half of the glucigrass, nearly half of the Orcuttieae inequalis, hairy orchid grass is more than half. Slender orchid grass is, well, it's really a weed, but a little less than half. Sacramento orchid grass we're still working on in Sacramento County, and we will eventually have all of that under protection. So in many cases, a large number of these species are under protection, which is a very, very good thing. So the whole idea of intersecting the two, and we weren't even done with the map when I decided we were going to do this. The whole thing behind intersecting the map and the survey was to give a time frame for what was lost prior to adopting the recovery plan versus what's been lost since then. And then, you know, fortuitously, the opportunity to look at what might be under protection. And so, you know, a lot of this stuff, some of the protected areas are sort of scary. I mentioned the waterfowl habitat, but also BLM lands in Tehama County are no longer grazed. That was my own time. Okay, I'm almost done. BLM lands aren't being grazed, and the feral pig population as a result is just monstrous. And so, you know, there's still some issues out there, but knowing that, you know, a lot of this land is in public ownership or under conservation easement is very good. But the numbers themselves don't tell the whole story. This is the infamous Hickman Vernal pools down in Stanislaus County. The biggest vernal pool in California. Amazing place. Well, this is the Hickman Vernal pools in 2005. This is the Hickman Vernal pools in 2012. And you can see that small portions were definitely extirpated. This happens to be almonds. But the biggest point here is that the encroachment of these almond orchards has totally changed the hydrology of these areas. And this little area here actually supports smallmouth bass. That's definitely an issue. So this is not listed as extirpated because there are a few little plants right up over there. But the habitat is being converted due to encroachment of incompatible land use. Thank you. I assume I have time for questions.
We have all kinds of time for questions because you have 3 minutes until it's lunch, and then if we'll have continue on with questions into lunch if you want.
Any questions? Yes.
You said that they're going to do something about the debriefing that you reported as some sort of action. Do you have any idea what that might end up being?
Usually it ends up being a negotiated settlement agreement. It often costs less than if they'd done the right thing and gotten a permit and everything in advance. But at least they're pursuing it. And that in itself is sort of important because it changes the culture. The local agriculture community hears about it, and you know, people become more aware of endangered species issues. Yes?
Is there any way of going at that from the angle of the companies who are, you know, advertising to do the debriefing and, you know,
I wish I'd put up the slide of the assortment of signs, plowing, disking, grading, with little tiny things this big with phone numbers to these giant signs out there of the companies that are doing that. I don't know, and that's an approach I haven't thought about before, and I'll definitely take it up with the service to see if there's some way that we can start educating those people. Rob?
Carol, do you have a sense of how much of this habitat destruction is intentional and non-habitat conversion, strictly? Like you see in some of the areas along I-5 where they just plow it up for political reasons?
Oh, Angelo does that all the time. It's like, if I plow it enough times over time, I don't plant it in anything, I just plow it. Maybe the vernal pools will go away, and then I can build houses on it. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on too. There's some consultants out there who have prided themselves in getting orchards and vineyards around the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act by going out and painting lines 25 feet away from the wetland boundary and then letting them deep rip all the rest. So a lot of it's going on. In Sacramento County, we're trying to get Gallo. Gallo's gonna purchase something that got deep ripped and put vineyards in. And we're trying to get them to do it the right way as far as permitting and everything else, to set a standard and to challenge the rest of the viticulture community to follow the law.